Elvis Presley didn't just lose Priscilla. He pushed her away piece by piece, until the love story the world idolized was already gone. On the outside they were untouchable, the king and his queen living inside the walls of Graceland like a fairy tale. But behind those gates, the truth was unraveling. Late nights, control, temptation, and unspoken pain created a slow fracture no one wanted to admit. Even Elvis himself couldn't face how far they'd drifted. Then Linda Thompson entered his world. She saw the broken pieces he tried to hide, the quiet regrets he rarely voiced. And years later, she revealed the real reason he finally let Priscilla go. Was it betrayal, a need for control, or something far more human that only those closest to him ever understood? When Elvis Presley and Priscilla Presley first met in Germany in the late 1950s, their story seemed destined for legend. He was the world's most electrifying performer, stationed overseas at the height of his fame. She was a shy teenager living with her family on a military base, captivated by the larger-than-life figure who swept through rooms with an energy unlike anyone she had ever met. Their connection was immediate. For Elvis, she represented innocence and stability during a chaotic time. For Priscilla, he was the embodiment of excitement and glamour. By the early 1960s, Elvis's star was still burning bright, and their relationship became a story fans followed like a serialized romance. When Priscilla moved into Graceland after finishing school, it was presented to the public as the continuation of a dream. She was poised, well-dressed, and carefully styled, always appearing as the picture of elegance beside him. Together they projected the image of a perfect couple living behind the gates of a southern palace. Newspapers and magazines published glowing stories about their bond, often painting Priscilla as a modern-day princess. Yet even in those early days, their relationship was built on carefully managed appearances. Elvis controlled nearly every aspect of their life together. Graceland wasn't just a home, it was a world entirely dictated by his rules, his routines, and his rhythms. He chose her clothes, her hair, and even the friends she spent time with. His career demanded constant attention, and his schedule revolved around late-night gatherings, impromptu jam sessions, and a loyal entourage who reinforced his authority. To the outside world, none of this was visible. Fans saw glamorous photographs of the couple arriving at events, or beaming on their wedding day in Las Vegas in 1967. Their marriage was covered like a royal celebration, with thousands of fans cheering for the storybook ending. Priscilla's soft-spoken demeanor reinforced the fantasy that their love existed untouched by fame or temptation. But inside Graceland, Priscilla was adjusting to a life where her independence slowly faded. She was surrounded by Elvis's inner circle, but often felt emotionally isolated, expected to orbit his world without complaint. Even so, the illusion held. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born in 1968, and for a brief period, it seemed like the Presley family had everything. Elvis returned to the stage with his famous television comeback, while Priscilla fulfilled her role as the serene partner at his side. Fans clung to the belief that their bond was unshakable. In reality, this was the beginning of a quiet imbalance. The public saw devotion, Priscilla felt control, and Elvis, already pulled between the demands of his career and his need for absolute loyalty, didn't notice how the foundation of their marriage was starting to crack. Once Priscilla moved into Graceland, her life was no longer truly her own. What had started as a romantic dream slowly transformed into a carefully controlled existence. Elvis had always been meticulous about his surroundings, and Graceland functioned less like a shared home and more like his personal kingdom. Everything revolved around his preferences, the schedule, the atmosphere, even the emotional tone of the house. Priscilla's days became shaped by his routines, and those routines were unlike anything she had known before. Elvis lived at night. He would often sleep through the day, rising in the late afternoon, then surrounding himself with friends, music, and movies that played until dawn. For the men in his entourage, this lifestyle was thrilling. For Priscilla, it was isolating. She adapted at first, staying awake into the early hours to match his rhythm, but the cost was steep. Friends from outside Elvis's world faded away. Her connection to normal teenage experiences vanished. Graceland had high fences, but the real boundaries were invisible and psychological. She also found herself under constant scrutiny. Elvis had a clear vision of how he wanted her to look and behave. He selected her clothes, dictated how she styled her hair, and expected her to present herself as an idealized version of femininity, polished, quiet, and devoted. Priscilla later admitted that she often felt like a beautiful figurine placed in the perfect position, rather than a partner with her own agency. Elvis's intentions were not always cruel. He truly believed he was creating a world where everything fit his image, but his need for control slowly smothered the sense of partnership between them. As his fame intensified, so did the emotional distance. Elvis became consumed with his career, recording sessions, movie shoots, and the relentless demands of being the king. While Priscilla remained physically present, their emotional connection began to weaken. Conversations grew shorter, affection became routine rather than spontaneous. The romantic excitement that had defined their early years together was replaced by the mechanics of maintaining Elvis's world. In private moments, Priscilla began to feel a growing sense of loneliness. Surrounded by people, but unable to share her true feelings, she lived in the shadow of his charisma. The Memphis Mafia, the close group of friends who occupied Graceland, reinforced Elvis's authority. They rarely questioned him, and few intervened when Priscilla's unhappiness surfaced. Inside this insulated environment, her quiet doubts went unnoticed. Still, to outsiders, their marriage looked perfect. The press saw photographs of them at events, carefully posed and smiling. No one could see the emotional distance that was taking root between them. Priscilla's world had narrowed to fit inside Elvis's, and that world left little room for her own growth. Over time, that loneliness became something she could no longer ignore. As the 1960s unfolded, Elvis's fame reached heights few could comprehend. He was not just a singer, he was a cultural phenomenon. Movie studios lined up to feature him as their leading man, fans surrounded every hotel he stayed in, and women across the country idolized him. On the surface, he remained the devoted husband, with Priscilla waiting at home in Graceland. But behind that image, temptation was everywhere, and Elvis rarely turned away from it. Throughout his film career, Elvis developed close relationships with many of his female co-stars. These weren't simply fleeting encounters, they often blurred the lines between on-screen chemistry and off-screen romance. Actresses like Anne Margaret became more than just colleagues. Their connection was passionate, intense, and widely whispered about, even if the press of the time handled the subject with discretion. These relationships were part of a pattern Elvis had long maintained, seeking emotional and physical closeness with other women while expecting unwavering loyalty from Priscilla. Priscilla, isolated within the world he built, began to hear the rumors. Sometimes the whispers came through friends. Other times the tabloids printed suggestive stories that she couldn't ignore. When Elvis returned home from filming, he often avoided discussing his time away in detail. He saw no contradiction between his behavior on the road and the expectation that Priscilla remained devoted to him. In his mind, his career came with a lifestyle that she should accept without question. As these patterns deepened, cracks in their marriage widened. Priscilla grew increasingly aware that she was living a life shaped by his rules but not his exclusivity. Her emotional needs were being overlooked, and resentment quietly built inside her. She admired him deeply, but began to recognize that their marriage existed on uneven ground. He could live freely, while she remained confined. By the early 1970s, Priscilla began to seek her own independence, not publicly, but within herself. She started taking dance lessons, making friends outside the Graceland circle, and exploring interests that didn't revolve around Elvis. It was during this time that she met Mike Stone, a karate instructor, who would become a central figure in the unraveling of her marriage. What began as a friendship eventually evolved into an affair, marking a decisive shift. For the first time, Priscilla crossed a line that Elvis had assumed only he could cross. When Elvis learned of her involvement with Stone, his reaction was explosive. He had engaged in affairs for years, but the idea of Priscilla doing the same wounded his pride deeply. Friends later described his emotional turmoil. He was hurt, furious, and confused. He saw her actions not as a response to years of distance, but as betrayal. This moment shattered the unspoken arrangement that had kept their marriage intact. Their lives had become defined by double standards and hidden resentments. Elvis's temptations and Priscilla's eventual response set into motion a chain of events that neither of them could fully undo. By the early 1970s, the marriage between Elvis and Priscilla had reached a fragile state. What had begun as a carefully curated fairy tale now resembled two separate lives bound by shared history rather than shared intimacy. Elvis's career remained relentless. He was touring, performing in Las Vegas, and surrounded by a loyal entourage that protected him from confronting uncomfortable truths. Priscilla, meanwhile, had quietly grown into a woman with her own needs, ambitions, and private longings, no longer the obedient teenager who moved into Graceland years earlier. Their emotional connection was fading, and both of them knew it. The affair with Mike Stone became the moment everything could no longer be ignored. Elvis's initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed quickly by anger and heartbreak. Friends later recalled how deeply wounded he was, not only because of the betrayal itself, but because it disrupted the unspoken balance he thought would never change. He had long justified his own behavior, but when Priscilla stepped outside the marriage, it forced him to face what their relationship had become. For a man who valued loyalty almost above all else, this was a blow that struck his pride and his heart. Priscilla, however, saw it differently. Her decision to leave wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of emotional distance, control, and infidelity. She had spent more than a decade adapting to Elvis's world, sacrificing much of her personal identity in the process. By 1972, she made the difficult decision to separate. She moved out of Graceland with their daughter Lisa Marie, leaving behind the carefully constructed image of the perfect couple. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of self-preservation. Elvis was devastated. Those close to him described a man who oscillated between sorrow and fury, unable to fully accept that she was truly gone. He had imagined their bond as unbreakable, even if imperfect. The idea that Priscilla would walk away shattered a part of his self-image. He was the king accustomed to control, adoration, and loyalty. Yet here was the one person who had known him before the height of fame, the woman who had shared his private world, choosing a life without him. When the divorce was finalized in 1973, the public narrative painted a surprisingly civil picture. They walked into the courthouse together, holding hands. Cameras captured smiles and polite gestures. It looked amicable, even graceful. But behind that poised image were years of tension, heartbreak, and unmet expectations. The fairy tale was over, but the bond between them wasn't entirely erased. Friends later said Elvis never truly got over Priscilla leaving. He spoke of her with a mix of admiration, longing, and frustration. It was a turning point that changed him profoundly. And when Linda Thompson entered his life shortly afterward, she walked into the aftermath of that emotional storm, a storm that would shape everything that came next. In the summer of 1972, only months after Priscilla left Graceland, Linda Thompson crossed paths with Elvis Presley for the first time. She was a former beauty queen from Memphis, known for her grace and kindness, and she was only 22 years old when she met him at a private movie screening. The timing was significant. Elvis was still reeling from the collapse of his marriage, emotionally raw yet outwardly determined to keep moving forward. When Linda entered his orbit, she didn't just meet a superstar. she met a man nursing invisible wounds. Their connection was almost immediate. Unlike many of the women who drifted through Elvis's world, Linda became a constant presence. She moved into Graceland not long after they began seeing each other, stepping into a role that combined companionship, support, and quiet observation. She was with him during tours, Las Vegas residencies, and long nights at home when his larger-than-life persona faded into something far more vulnerable. She saw the side of Elvis that the public never did: his spiritual searching, his insomnia, his insecurities, and his deep longing for stability. Linda would later describe this period as one of both deep love and profound complexity. She adored Elvis, but she was acutely aware that she was stepping into a space once occupied by Priscilla. The walls still held memories. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, visited often. Photographs of Elvis and Priscilla were everywhere. Linda wasn't replacing her, she was witnessing the aftermath. Elvis spoke about Priscilla frequently, sometimes fondly, sometimes with lingering pain. His feelings toward his former wife were complicated, a mix of nostalgia, hurt pride, and enduring affection. What Linda offered him was emotional steadiness. She didn't try to control him or challenge his lifestyle in the way Priscilla eventually did. Instead, she adapted to his rhythms, joining the late nights, listening to his thoughts, and providing comfort when the weight of fame grew heavy. Friends noticed that Linda's calming presence often softened his volatile moods. She was young, empathetic, and deeply loyal, qualities that resonated with the parts of Elvis that craved unwavering devotion. Yet even in their closeness, Linda began to understand what had strained his marriage. Elvis needed control over his environment. He struggled with emotional vulnerability, often masking it with humor, music, or distraction. He could be intensely loving one moment and distant the next. And while he loved deeply, he found it difficult to adapt to a partnership built on equality. Linda recognized these traits early, not with bitterness, but with clear-eyed honesty. She was seeing the emotional architecture of a man who had lived his entire adult life as a global icon, always surrounded but rarely challenged. This perspective would shape her understanding of why his marriage to Priscilla had ultimately crumbled. She wasn't just another romantic partner, she was an observer standing inside his private world, piecing together the fragments of a love story that had already broken. Years after Elvis's death, Linda Thompson began to speak more openly about the time she spent with him and the truths she witnessed up close. She never framed herself as the woman who took Priscilla's place. Instead, she positioned herself as someone who loved him deeply and understood his inner struggles. When she spoke about the end of his marriage, her words carried a unique weight. She had been there, not as a distant observer, but as the person who lived beside him when the emotional dust was still settling. Linda's perspective was clear. Elvis loved Priscilla profoundly. He spoke about her often with tenderness, reminiscing about their early years together in Germany and their shared history at Graceland. But Linda also saw the emotional walls he had built around himself. She described him as a man who craved unconditional devotion, but struggled to offer the same in return. He needed to be adored, protected, and understood, yet he often kept his truest feelings locked away. In her eyes, his inability to adapt to an equal partnership was at the heart of why his marriage unraveled. She explained that Elvis had spent his entire adult life as a star, surrounded by people who catered to him. He didn't have to compromise. He didn't have to change his routines or question his own needs. When Priscilla grew into her own independence, developing interests outside of him, making decisions for herself, he admired her but didn't know how to share space with her as an equal. Linda observed that this shift unsettled him deeply. He still loved her, but the dynamic that had defined their relationship had changed, and he didn't know how to bridge that gap. Linda also reflected on his emotional contradictions. He wanted Priscilla to remain loyal and devoted, even as he maintained relationships with other women. He expected the structure of their marriage to remain fixed, while his behavior remained fluid. When Priscilla stepped outside of that structure, it forced him to confront realities he had long avoided. Linda's insight was that Elvis didn't leave Priscilla simply because of her affair or out of anger. He let go because deep down, he couldn't sustain the kind of partnership she eventually needed. In her memoir, Linda described Elvis as a man torn between the image the world demanded of him and the emotional truths he could never fully face. She didn't blame him. She didn't vilify Priscilla. Instead, she painted a picture of two people whose paths had diverged, one growing toward independence, the other still trapped inside the expectations of fame and control. Her reflections gave fans a more nuanced understanding of the breakup, moving the story beyond simple blame towards something more human, a love that couldn't survive the weight of who Elvis had become. After their divorce was finalized in 1973, Elvis and Priscilla's lives took separate paths, but their story didn't end with court papers. In the years that followed, they forged an unusual post-marriage relationship, one that was more respectful and enduring than many might have expected. Despite the heartbreak, resentment, and public scrutiny, they remained closely connected, united by their shared history and their love for their daughter Lisa Marie. Priscilla began to build a life of her own, outside of Elvis's shadow. She pursued business ventures, took acting roles, and gradually emerged as a figure with her own identity. For the first time since her teenage years, she was making choices that reflected her needs, not someone else's expectations. It wasn't an easy transition. The public still associated her with the king, and her every move was observed through the lens of their past. But she embraced this new chapter with determination, becoming the driving force behind preserving Elvis's legacy after his death. Elvis, meanwhile, was never quite the same after she left. Friends and those close to him noticed a subtle but undeniable shift. He continued to perform, selling out arenas and captivating audiences. But privately, the emotional toll of the breakup lingered. He remained close to Priscilla, often turning to her for advice or simply enjoying her company in quiet moments. She attended some of his concerts, and their interactions were often described as warm and familiar, as if their bond had simply changed shape rather than disappeared. Linda Thompson witnessed this evolving relationship firsthand during her years with him. She saw how Priscilla's name could soften his mood, how memories of their early years would surface unexpectedly. In interviews, Linda later reflected that Elvis never stopped loving Priscilla. He simply couldn't maintain the marriage under the weight of his own lifestyle. Their connection became more like that of two old companions who had shared a singular experience, something no one else could fully understand. As the years passed, the world continued to mythologize Elvis and Priscilla's relationship. Fans debated what went wrong, some choosing sides, others romanticizing their story as a lost fairy tale. But Linda's perspective added a quieter, more personal dimension. She had seen the vulnerability behind the legend, the emotional contradictions that defined him, and the way he spoke of Priscilla when the cameras weren't rolling. Her revelations didn't diminish their love story, they deepened it. When Elvis died in 1977, Priscilla stepped forward as the guardian of his legacy, ensuring that Graceland became a living monument to his life. Linda, too, remained respectful, often speaking warmly of their time together and of Priscilla's unique role in his life. In the end, the story wasn't about blame or betrayal. It was about a love that began as a dream, faltered under the pressures of fame, and endured in a different form until the very end. Elvis and Priscilla's story has often been told as a glittering romance that ended in betrayal. But when seen through Linda Thompson's eyes, it becomes something deeper and more human. It wasn't a single act that ended their marriage. It was years of shifting identities, emotional walls, and expectations that neither of them could fully meet. Elvis loved Priscilla, but he couldn't adapt to the changes that time and personal growth demanded. Priscilla loved him, but she needed a life beyond his shadow. Linda's reflections don't rewrite history, they illuminate it. She saw the pain behind the legend, the regret that surfaced in quiet moments, and the way he held on to memories of the woman he once called the love of his life. Their story is not just about what ended, but about what endured, a lasting bond that defied the public narrative. For more emotional stories, check out this video.